is the last full week of content and mini lectures, and this week we're going to be kind of continuing our discussion of civil rights movements and social justice movements in American politics. And today we're going to look at the women's suffrage movement and women's rights movements more broadly, and then Wednesday we'll be kind of broadening this question out to look at the LGBTQ movement as well as indigenous rights movements and others. So for today, our goals are to look at the kind of history of the women's suffrage movement, but also not to think of these not just as historical kind of developments, but also to think through some of the politics. So using some of the analytic tools, theories, and concepts that we've been discussing this class, to think about how these are political and what the politics of these movements' success and failures are, and what we can learn about them for more contemporary political questions. So, should be abundantly clear, despite the universal Republican claims of the Declaration of Independence, the women were disenfranchised in the early Republic, with the notable exception of New Jersey. It was only free landowning males who could vote. New Jersey originally their state constitution originally allowed landowning women to vote, but they changed that in 1807. So in the early days of the American Republic, these Republican institutions were barred by women. Women couldn't vote, they couldn't run for office, and there was also this legal doctrine of coverture, in which legal personhood was consolidated into the male head of households. So the married women lost their legal personhood to their husbands. They couldn't own property. Any profits from any property was managed and kind of directed by their husbands. They weren't to the status of slaves, but their legal personhood was bound up in their husbands, and without the ability to exercise political rights, and their inability to hold economic property, to exercise economic freedom, the freedom was significantly restricted. Thus, we get. This is despite the fact that we get, even in 1776, in a spring letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams, where she writes, "I long to hear that you declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice, or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, and such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and lawless to use with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor these customs which treat us as only vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness." Now, needless to say, despite Abigail Adams' strong warnings of a rebellion of the women against male-dominated political institutions, John Adams and the other framers of the Constitution did not take this to heart. So in this context, we have the early movements of the women's suffrage movement. And it has its origins in, as your textbook notes, women's involvement in the abolition movement. Two of the early leaders of the movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, actually met through their work in the abolitionist movement, but they were, despite being fervent supporters of the abolition of slavery, they were excluded and they were mistreated in many ways by the abolition movement. And so this led that Mott and Stanton to convene in the July of 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, the Seneca Falls Convention, which advertised itself as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions of the rights of women. It was a 2-day convention in which there were various course classes and seminars and workshops on both legal theory and politics and organizing. Speeches were given, and ultimately they also concluded. They also drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, in which they parody the language of the Declaration of Independence, using the exact same language, such as, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume Among the people of Earth, this position different from that which they hitherto occupied. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men and women are created equal, that they are created endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And so this Declaration of Sentiments parodies the Declaration of Independence and then goes through a list of grievances of women against men. Listing a long train of abuses, and the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And this is not unsurprising, especially that this strategy is used. That this strategy is similar to the strategy that Frederick Douglass would later use in What to a Slave is the 4th of July, because Frederick Douglass was actually an attendee of the Seneca Falls Convention. So this overlap kind of moves in both directions. Additionally, many women, in addition to the abolition movement, many women were also involved in, such as Susan B. Anthony, in focusing on access to and rights of education, including higher education, as well as the temperance movement. The Christian Women's Temperance League argued that the abuse of alcohol facilitated the abuse of wives and children by husbands and fathers, and that in order to protect women from their abusive spouses, it was necessary to basically prohibit the consumption of alcohol. The women's suffrage movement, despite its origins in the mid-19th century, would not become successful until the 19th until the 20th century and with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Stanton and Anthony together formed the National Women's Suffrage Association that focused on the right to vote, and the goal here was to expand suffrage beyond just the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote could not be restricted on previous conditions of servitude, but also to guarantee that there would be no discrimination on the right to vote on the basis of sex. Other women's movement leaders, including Alice Paul, who formed the National Women's Party, advocated for more direct confrontational forms of political action, including public protests and pickets. Paul herself went on a hunger strike before was being forced fed by authorities to prevent her hunger strike. And the National Women's Party picketed in front of the White House 6 days a week. The President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated until the 19th Amendment passed through the Congress, guaranteeing women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment, which was passed through Congress in 1919 and ratified in 1920, guarantees that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, and that Congress shall have appropriate power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And in many ways, the experience of World War I helped create political and electoral pressure for the 19th Amendment, in which many women's suffrage advocates argued that the experience and sacrifices made during wartime proved that they were just as civic-minded and just as patriotic as men, and therefore they should be rewarded with the right to vote. Now, we often tell the story of women's suffrage through the lens of these famous names in your textbook, and I have just kind of done that. But in the additional reading for today's class, political science professor Corrine McConnaughy at GW argues that when we do so, we end up losing some of the actual politics of the women's suffrage movement. That this wasn't a clear progress line led by leaders such as Stanton and Anthony, but we have to think of this in terms of timing and political coalition building. And so one of the points that she makes in this article, and I've reproduced the map here that the article references, my apologies that it did not get reproduced when I uploaded it to Moodle, was that in many cases, because of federalism, women's rights to vote were already guaranteed in many states well before the 19th Amendment was passed. For example, as many states in the West already had passed these amendments, and we'll talk about the institutional reasons why in just a second, well before the 19th Amendment was passed on a federal level. And so she discusses the example of Michigan, our friends over here. in the article, in which women gained the right to vote in Michigan only when farming interest group the Grange decided to make it a priority. And then when they were able to exert significant electoral influence as farming interests became more and more important in the state legislature, they were able to actually exert a sufficient legislative and electoral pressure to actually get the women's suffrage legislation passed at the state level. You can also consider the case of Wyoming over here. Which, as you'll note, and you might be surprised to note, was the first territory granted women's suffrage in 1869. And when it became a state in 1890, it was the first state to have full suffrage for women. In 1869, Louisa Ann Swain of Laramie, Wyoming, became the first woman to cast a vote in general election. Now, what are some of the reasons here? So part of it was actually because it was much easier to pass suffrage in a territory than a state. The territories only required a majority vote of the legislature and the governor's signature for passage on a suffrage bill, while states, on the other hand, required a constitutional amendment, which required a 60% vote in both houses, the governor's acceptance, and the approval of the people in a special election. So the institutional reasons were that there was significantly fewer obstacles to pass. But also Wyoming wanted to become a state. They wanted to move, and that required a certain size of the electorate and enough voters in order to vote to become, at the state level, to vote to become state. To become a state from a territory. And so women's suffrage was a way to kind of pack the voter rolls. Other historians have noted that in Wyoming, part of what was going on was to maintain a majority white voting bloc, that by providing for women's suffrage, that would provide more white voters, and there would be voters of color to ensure political power, and that it would create party loyalty for for the Democratic Party that passed the right to vote for women in Wyoming. And so you can think about the different kind of political calculations that are at work here, instead of it just being a kind of slow road of progress. And so McConnaughy draws three key conclusions that you should keep in mind. First is that it wasn't simply enough to have concerted movement politics, that mobilization was not enough to challenge partisan interests and electoral pressure. That these groups were not successful just purely because they mobilized lots of women to march in the streets, but these groups but women's suffrage movement became successful instead, and this is her second conclusion, when they were able to build coalitions and change the electoral incentives. And what this means is that voting rights for women were delivered without actually solving sexism, without actually changing people's minds about gender equality. That changing hearts and minds wasn't actually necessary to achieve these more pragmatic expansion of rights, as long as you were able to create the electoral incentive to do so. And then this means that her third conclusion, that political context and timing are important. That these matter far more than the eloquence of speakers or the particular characteristics of leaders of movements. So after the 19th Amendment, the shift of the women's movements focused towards full civil equality, so focusing on civil rights, not just voting rights. And this kind of crystallized around the Equal Rights Amendment, and that was the text of which was co-authored by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman, and it reads that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This was first introduced to Congress in 1923 and was brought up to a vote in Congress every session of Congress after 1923, but the ERA didn't pass both the House and Senate until 1972, and then it was sent to a ratification with a deadline of 1979. It failed to reach enough states by the 1979 deadline and was extended to 1982. But in 1982, it not only had 35 of the necessary 38 states in 1982, but 5 states, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Idaho, had rescinded their vote in support of the ERA, which meant that it was probably not going to pass even after the deadline. However, in more recent years, especially in the context of the Me Too movement, and some Democratic resurgence after the 2016 election, Nevada over here, Illinois, and Virginia. Oh wait, we want blue here, and color blue. All join the ranks of states who have passed the Equal Rights Amendment at the state level, which technically meant that 38 states have ratified it. However, the legal status is still unclear for a couple of reasons. First, because it is well after the 1982 deadline for ratification. And second, because of the 5 states that have rescinded their ratification, so that it has not actually gone into effect despite having a majority of states having voted to ratify it at some point. There's more on if you're interested in this. FX is just beginning a series on called Mrs. America on the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s and the different kind of figures in the feminist movement and opponents of the feminist movement, including Phyllis Schlafly, that were involved in these debates. So outside of constitutional reform, the women's rights kind of were expanded with a series of legislation, including Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which in addition to prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of race and national origin, also includes on the basis of sex, in addition to religion, race, and national origin. Now, this clause was actually inserted by Howard Smith, a Democratic member of the House of Representatives from Virginia, who had spent several times trying to block the bill by holding it out of committee and refusing to let it go out of committee, but eventually let it out of committee, but with the following addition that he added, and you can see this is a copy of the bill, markup copy of the bill here, and you can't quite read the notes here, but they say on page 68, line 23, after the word religion, insert the word sex, and this is what this is this kind of notes here, these edits over here, that in addition, any points where discrimination is mentioned, he added the word sex. And he did this with the goal of trying to kill the bill that by adding prohibitions of sexual discrimination in employment to the Civil Rights Act, that it would actually lose support. Ultimately, his gamble failed and the bill still passed. So Title VII includes that employment discrimination that prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sex as well as other protected classes. Additionally, Title IX of the United States Education Amendments in 1972 notes that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, often Title IX, we think of the role of equal funding for sports programs and other academic and other co-curricular programming that means that there has to be equal opportunity for participation, which means that schools can't spend more money on men's sports than they do on women's sports. But this also has significant implications for significant implications for learning environments, as it requires that there cannot be discriminatory learning environments on the basis of sex, which includes specific provisions for the management and reporting of sexual harassment and sexual assault in schools that receive federal financial assistance, which is basically in some form or another every college or university, because many of them receive grants to conduct research. And that's why we have Title IX offices on colleges and universities to handle complaints of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and other sexual discrimination. Now, to kind of think about the gender politics today, many have suggested that we are now in a new wave of feminist politics. And this language of a new wave is based on this idea that feminism has moved through a series of waves. The first wave from 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, to 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, was the women's suffrage movement. And though it has its origins in the abolition movement, it was largely a white-led movement and was criticized for not addressing the concerns of black women or empowering them in the movement. And the focus here was on the right to vote, The second wave of feminism, from the 1960s through the 1980s, was really catalyzed by Betty Friedan's publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which was a bestseller, and it brought feminist thinking into the kind of mainstream of many American women, broadening the focus on structural gender oppression. The focus here was about systemic sexism ingrained in society and demanding for the full civil rights and legal equality, and the kind of ending of gender-based discrimination. In many ways, this is kind of viewed as a radical phase in feminism. This kind of movement for women's liberation, which then transitioned into the third wave of feminism in the 1990s, with the Anita Hill hearings, which catalyzed a focus on intersectionalities of racism and patriarchy, and broader attention to the role of race and ethnic minorities within the feminist movement, within systems of oppression, but also a kind of a more punk version of feminism, as popularized by the Riot Girl Manifesto, that notes that because doing, reading, seeing, hearing cool things that validate and challenge us can help us to gain the strength and sense of community that we need in order to figure out how bullshit like racism, able-bodyism, ageism, speciesism, classism, finism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and heterosexism figure in our own lives, because we are angry at a society that tells us girl equals dumb, girl equals bad, girl equals weak. And in this language tried to reclaim girl. It was much more emphasis around empowerment, and much more emphasis about like sexual empowerment, where many second wave feminists were more against pornography, sexual prostitution. One of the kind of axes of this third wave was kind of focusing on rights of sex workers and sexual empowerment. Now, some have argued that in light of the Me Too movement, the women's marches following the election of Donald Trump, that we have now entered in a fourth wave of feminism. Others have argued that at this point we are just like, these categories have no real analytical distinction, but the kind of growing salience of forms of workplace discrimination, casual sexism, the kind of ubiquity of discrimination, sexism, and sexual harassment in our society as kind of the target of this new burgeoning wave of feminism. So how do gender rights kind of sit to these days? Well, there are still glaring economic disparities. As you're probably all familiar, women on average earn about 79 cents for every dollar earned by men. And this is for fully employed women. They're also more likely to be single parents, more likely to live below the poverty line. And in 2012, households headed by single women are twice as likely to live below the poverty line than those headed by single men. There's also much discussion around the gendering of divisions of labor and pay inequality, that it's not simply that women are just being paid less, but the types of work that are traditionally gendered are rewarded differently in society, both monetarily and with social prestige. For example, your textbook discusses the difference between a childcare worker and a garbage collector. The childcare worker earns on average $9.12 an hour, where a garbage collector earns around $15.34 an hour. And these are pretty gendered. The garbage collectors tend to be men, and childcare workers tend to be women. And this gendering of the division labor, in which reproductive work and care work and domestic labor is fulfilled often by women, and therefore it is less respected and less well compensated than roles that are traditionally fulfilled by men. Additionally, many point to the lack of maternity leave, which has a significant disincentivizing effect on women's careers if women choose to have children, and again, because of the gender division of household labor, tend to become the primary caregivers, as well as needing time for their bodies to recover after giving birth. This lack of maternity leaves creates what's known as a leaky pipeline, in which many women, they leave their careers or they fall behind in their careers because of having and raising children. Thinking more in terms of the representation in politics, in 2019, only 24% of the seats in Congress were held by women. And it doesn't get much better at the state level, where 29% of seats in state legislatures were held by women. And only a quarter of women in Congress are Republicans. And we can think of a few different reasons behind this. Obviously, many would point to ideology, many arguing that because of the kind of social sorting that we've talked about throughout this semester, that abortion rights and women's rights tend to are polarized into the Democratic Party. As well, and other explanations focus on political pipelines, that there's more of a pipeline for women to move from state office to national office on the Democratic Party, as well as linkages between women's groups like the National Organization of Women and Emily's List with the Democratic Party. But more recently, political scientists Michelle Swears and Danielle Thompson argue for a different answer that focuses on donors, that Democratic donors make electing women a more specific goal, while Republican donors do not. And more specifically, Democratic women favor donating to female candidates, while Republican women donate equally between male and female candidates. And so Democratic women prioritize not only the election of Democrats, but the election of women in their political donations. And that means that there's going to be more women that make it out of primary contests on the Democratic Party than on the Republican Party, contributing to this asymmetric pipeline. So next class, we're going to conclude our last topic for the semester by talking about other struggles for recognition and equal rights, including LGBT movement, indigenous rights, and other ethnic minorities. The last two sections of the civil rights chapter in the textbook, as well as a brief article on indigenous rights activism by Nick Estes. And for the discussion threads, the last discussion thread you'll have to write for my class, think about the political lessons of the women's suffrage movement that McConnaughy describes. Apply these lessons to a contemporary political issue that you care about. How might these lessons inform contemporary political movements? As a reminder, the 200-word posts are due by Friday at midnight, and the 100-word replies are due by Sunday at midnight. So that's going to wrap things up for us in our class today. As always, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to email me or stop into office hours or the discussion sections so that we can answer any questions that you have. I will have the final take-home exam questions uploaded soon, so you'll be able to begin working on those as well. As always, stay safe, stay inside, wash your hands, take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you next time. Take care.